The Honourable the Vice President.
Senator Dillon-Remy.
Mr. Vice President, I thank you for allowing me to contribute to this important debate on the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019. I, too, concur with the sentiments that have been expressed by persons who would have contributed before on the importance of this bill. The number of sexual abuse cases, particularly against children in Trinidad and Tobago, must be reduced. I do commend the Minister for bringing this bill to the Senate as one of the tools to assist in curbing of these crimes. As I say, it is one of the tools. I have seen a number of cases of child abuse in my years of pediatric practice. There have not been many, but I've seen, and one case is too many. The cases that I have seen, the perpetrators have usually been family members or trusted friends, as others have mentioned before. My comments will be related to Clause 10 of the bill, and Section 35(1) says, where a person is charged with a registrable offense, the court shall make an order requiring that the person be medically examined for the purpose of determining whether the person is suffering from a sexually transmitted infection. Which sexually transmitted infection are we talking about? There are more than 30 types of sexually transmitted infections, be it bacteria, viruses, or parasitic infections. Some of them can be tested for very simply by blood tests, and we think of things like HIV and syphilis. However, many of them you cannot test easily for them. It does not mean, therefore, that the person does not have a sexually transmitted infection, but if you are testing and assuming that a negative test means that the person does not have an infection, you may be wrong. And as I said, currently the tests that are available easily within the public sector include those for HIV and syphilis and gonorrhea is if the person actually has a discharge. But if the person does not have a discharge, you may not know whether that person has an infection or not. And the other important thing is that these people, some people may not have symptoms of sexually transmitted infection, but they can still pass it on to the person who they've had sexual contact with. And if you are not testing for, or you don't have tests for important diseases like chlamydia and human papillomavirus, what are you going to get as a result of the testing? The way it is put here, it seems as though you just do a test for STIs and you know whether this person has an STI. And I'm suggesting that that may not be, and it needs to be looked at. It is probably an opportunity that something like this is being considered now for the Ministry of Health to look at the types of testing, to increase, to expand the number of tests that are available for sexually transmitted infections, because this is not something that is just for sex offenders. This is something that for people in a situation where we have an epidemic of STIs. And this is not just us, this is worldwide. So it is possibly an opportunity for in preparation for this type of activity coming to this act being proclaimed, that by that time there will be more, an increased number of tests that are available for sexually transmitted infections. And as again, I would also say that it is important to know when you are testing, you have appropriate protocols in place. because there are some sexually transmitted infections that may not be, like HIV, you may not test for it positive initially. And therefore, you have to have some protocol in place for retesting. And therefore, systems must be put in place for that, so that you don't, again, just assume that the person does not have an infection when the person is incubating the infection at that point in time. Mr. Vice President, subsection 3, 35.3 says, where an examination conducted in accordance with subsection 1 or 2 reveals that the person examined is found to be suffering from a STI, information to that effect shall be immediately communicated to, and they talked about the person, but also the virtual complainant, the representative where that person has died, etc. These tests are going to be available. The results of those tests are going to be available for the most part, I would say, within a month. This person is still innocent. In other words, this person is still just charged but not found guilty. I mean, the person has not come to trial as yet. And therefore, if you have, for instance, information from that person, suppose the person tests positive for HIV at that point in time, you are going to share that information with somebody who then has information on you, and you are still considered presumed innocent. That has to be taken into consideration, because when the trial eventually comes, if that person is found not guilty, you would have shared information with other persons about that person that would be very, very detrimental to that person. It has to be looked at very seriously. The other area is in clauses 8 and 9 of the bill. Clause 8 says that the Section 26 was amended by etc., and the registerable offenses that they are talking about specifically refers to parts 4 to 6 and 8 of the Children's Act. What are they? Parts 4 talks about offense of female genital mutilation. Parts 5, abuse of children through prostitution. Part 6, other sexual offenses. And Part 8, Section 8, child pornography. These are offenses which the person can be charged under. Many of these offenses have nothing to do with actual penetration or even touching the other person. Why, therefore, are you going to have that this person must be mandatorily tested for a sexually transmitted infection? I'm suggesting that that needs to be looked at, because the types of possible crimes that you are committing here, some of them have nothing to do at all with sexual penetration or even sexual touching. And according to what is written here, once the person is charged with a registerable offense, the court shall make mandatory testing. It may not be necessary. The other area I would like to address is Section 35.4. The virtual complainant of a registerable offense may be medically examined for the purpose of determining whether the person is suffering from a STI. Who decides may? Is it the person says, I want to be examined, or I don't want to be examined, or is it someone else? A court, someone else, the police. Who decides on whether that person is examined or not? That needs to be specified here. And the other thing is that since the results, let's say the person is examined and the results of that person's test are going to determine, it says on section 6B, it says, being satisfied on a balance of probabilities that the virtual complainant contracted an infection. So the testing at that point in time will indicate will let you know whether that person has a STI, that you are going to decide whether that STI is caused by the offense, let's say. It means, again, that it is very important that what you do in terms of testing of that person be considered carefully. Because the other thing is that you test a person at that point in time, the person may be incubating an infection from some other sexual. It may not be the first time the person is having a sexual encounter. And that person may be incubating. How do you know that this disease that you have found at that point in time is necessarily related to the offense? It is something that is not as easy to do as it is written here. So it has to be given, good consideration. Okay. Okay, that has to, there's another point I wanted to make about that, about the testing. The registerable offenses, I talked about that already. Okay, the other point I would make, Mr. Vice President, is about because lots of persons have talked already about the registry, I just want to make 2 points. One is that we don't give a false sense of security that by having a registry, we know the sex offenders. And that's because it was already said that about 80% of people do not make reports, do not report sexual offenses. Therefore, if we are putting the registry out there as let's say, the be-all and end-all, these are the sex offenses that you have in your community, it will be giving people a false sense of security. And we ourselves would probably be fooling ourselves that we are letting people know who the offenders are when there are many other offenders who may be, as Senator Rambarat said, right in your homes, and nobody knows who they are because you are not reporting because of the other social issues and stuff like that. So I'm just saying, yes, I think they should have a registry, but please do not let people think that the registry is the be-all and end-all of reporting of sex offenses, because most of the people would not be on that registry. And the other point I would like to make is that the public should be made aware of the fact that accessing information on the registry cannot remove the responsibility of the individual. For instance, the persons who are trusted, parents and guardians, etc., does not remove the responsibility of those individuals taking care of children to make sure that they take the responsibility for their children and therefore do their own investigations around the society and in other words, the public must be aware about what is happening in terms of our children and be educated so that we do not put our children at risk to the degree that we can. We must be more vigilant. And I'm saying, again, the sex offenses register would only give a small proportion of those persons who may be committing offenses and should not give us a false sense of security. And with that, Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Senator Deyalsingh.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for allowing me to partake in this discussion, the Sexual Offences Bill 2019. As I looked at the parent bill, it covers a lot of things it covers there in terms of rape, incest, gross indecency, prostitution, among other crimes. And as I looked at the bill and I heard the presentation from the Attorney General, I heard the pain in the anger and the pain in his voice, you know, that we actually, he was plain to us that we need to pass this bill. There's a need to get this urgently. I saw his anger. He said he's drawing the line. And the figures that he had given us, that the Children's Authority produced since, you know, from the 2015 to the 2018, 14,581. It's alarming. And between the ages of 1 to 3, we see 787 children were abused. And we have the figures there. And, you know, going down the line from different ages, 4 to 6, 1,604, 7 to 9, 1,837, 10 to 13, 3,548. So this huge amount of cases that was brought to light by the Children's Authority shocked many persons. Many persons out there would stop me and say, Doc, we didn't know that this was happening in our country. But the thing is, for years now, persons in the medical profession knew that this was occurring. They knew this, you know, it was one of the best kept secrets. It was a hidden epidemic, you know, and when you look at the amount of cases that was brought forth, and the fact that it's only 1 in 7 may be actually brought to light, and a lot of those cases are what you call underground, hidden. It's not brought to light. So it's there, people are out there, people are suffering. Children are getting abused, they're getting raped by their neighbors, their cousins, their grandfathers, their fathers. And sometimes in my clinic, in the health clinic where we see these patients, you may see an adult suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder, an adult suffering from depression, anxiety. And you see them suffering from different psychiatric conditions. And if you go back in the past, sometimes you realize that person was abused as a child, and it manifests years later. So if we are looking at the increasing mental illness in the country, the increasing persons who suffer from emotional distress, we have to look at what's happening in their homes, and what's happening in when they are childhood. We really need to address this. And the delays that was highlighted, you know, the delay where, you know, 2015 to 2018, where some of the offenses, it looked like 470 pending at the Supreme Court and 149 pending, you know, of those cases pending for over 10 years. These children, you know, if they at 12, they would be an adult, they would go through that whole life. And the trauma of having to come to court to face this, it's like you're re-traumatizing the system. And I've always said a slow-paced judicial system re-traumatizes these victims. And we have to look at this. And I'm happy to be in Parliament where we looked at the legislation where we said that, you know, we will have to fast-track certain cases from the magistrates court, the preliminary inquiry. So things are being done to see if we can fast-track certain matters that would help and assist these victims of sexual abuse and victims of crime. Senator Amin actually looked at the conviction rates, and it was alarming that out of 13,000 cases, there's only 2.3 conviction rate. So when we look at it, there are a lot of children being abused in their homes, and they are not coming in the public domain. We don't know about it. Years later, they come to us, and I may see someone, and I'm caught in a dilemma that if I see somebody, and they go in and they say, Doc, as a child, I was raped, and we go into that history. I want to ask the Attorney General, could we go back in time and see how could we get that person who did that offending? Because it would have happened years ago. There's no evidence. But you see, we are creatures of habit. And that individual who may have abuse that child will look at another child, and that may be another victim, a potential victim. And I had a case recently where a 19-year-old came to me. She's schizophrenic, split personality. When I say split personality, I mean hearing voices, not schizophrenia. The term is split personality, but it's really not that. It's hallucinations, illusions. She's paranoid, hearing voices. And when we settled her down, she told me she was raped by her stepfather. And when we settled her down further, her fear is that stepfather has moved on, left that common law, and is living with a new woman, and that woman has 2 daughters. And she told me that, and and we were helpless to do anything because the guy wasn't charged, but we know that danger. We believed her because we believe she got ill because of what atrocities happened to her. How are we going to protect that other family? So we couldn't legally go in and warn them, but our social worker is very brilliant. Anonymous letter to the mother of the other children, just warning her. Did their part. But we felt helpless. We felt impotent that we couldn't really somehow have something set up in place to prevent 2 other girls who may be abused. So those are the practicalities we see and we face in our clinics. And as a medical student years ago, I remember I was shocked when I attended a clinic in Chaguanas, and there were warts going in the anus of a 4-year-old child. And the doctor then told me, hey, this is a child who was sexually abused. So as a student, medical student, I was, I now open up to the world of what goes on in the community, what goes on in society. And so those figures that the Children's Health Authority had, I knew that for years. Daphne Phillips, a parliamentarian who served here, past member of this House, this Parliament, she had a report in 2008 where she studied the political economy of school violence in Trinidad. She looked at certain schools, junior secondary schools in the East-West Corridor, children who were behaving violent. And she wondered why. Let's see what's happening to these guys. Why are these children violent? And when she looked at that study, the cause of violence in those children crying out for help, she found 10% said neglect. Their parents may have been gone, the mother may have gone abroad, left them with the grandmother. 40% said sexual abuse was a cause of stress, 40%. So we knew that 2008 and even before that. Verbal abuse, 5%, poverty, 30%, and physical abuse, 15%. So the figures were there. And even before that, decades before, I knew that we had a sick society. It was a sick society. And even in 2002, a study done in Tobago, and when I read this study, I actually saw Dr. Remy's name there as one of the I don't know if a participant of it. It was a study where, 2002, they looked at early sexual activity, and it raises HIV risk for Trinidad and Tobago girls. So it's a finding of teenage, a teenage survey they looked, and it calls for, policy change in the light of HIV and AIDS. It was 2002. So it was a study of the findings of teenage and calling for key policy changes in the light of HIV. 2002, the author was Fraser T. And it was a study, a survey conducted of 676 young adults in Tobago, 10 to 29 years old. And the Family Planning Association did it with the AIDS Society, the Caribbean Epidemiology Center, with support from the Dutch Embassy, the German Technical Cooperation Agency. And the study found that sexual activity starts as early as 10 years. The average age being 14 years old for boys and girls combined. 13% of those between 10 and 14 years had sex. The overall young age of sexual initiation, as reported by the study, reaffirms that young people between the ages of 10 and 24 years are at risk of acquiring HIV infection. So they looked at the sexual practice, what is happening to our children in Tobago. And what they found is 6% of the young people surveyed, all girls, said they had sex with a father, a stepfather, an uncle, or older people, especially girls, assuming high-risk behavior at an early age. And this had to do with the failure of parents. That was one of the conclusions, the failure of parents to speak to the children about sex, to educate the children about sex. And Mr. Vice President, I have been battling with this problem with adults coming in with mental problems, having it, manifesting as unfortunate childhood events. And as far back as 15 years ago, I had meetings with the then education, ministry and minister then. And what I tried to say is, listen, we have to get at the cause of it. We have to get these children to come out and speak. And there's something called good touch, bad touch. And there's some movement where they actually show you. They can actually have posters. You could go to school. You could learn what is a good touch, what is a bad touch, who's supposed to teach you. And I told the Minister of Education then, as we teach children ABC, we have to teach them good touch, bad touch. So this is something, it's part of life because it is there, it was glaring, it was there facing us. And if 15 years ago, in this syllabus that was introduced, we would have had children that if their father even touched them inappropriately, they would have raised an alarm. Just as how they see A and they see apple, a bad touch would have raised an alarm. Hey, something is wrong. Let me go and get it. We need to do that. And I'm hoping that the Attorney General could even try to see if we can get that introduced in school. Introduce that good touch. Because then, remember, we are looking at the registry. Those are the offenders who have made it here, but it's such a small amount. The vast majority are walking amongst us. That's right. Jacket and tie, going about their business. Some of them would be a priest who was allowed to leave the country, a curator who got away here from the zoo, a brilliant author, if you look at his book on zoological animals. But when he reached the States, they held him. Yeah, they held him. And so what I'm guarding at is, you have to look at these offenders. And if they have their ring here, their pictures here, they're engaging in sex there, they go abroad also to look for children. People go to Taiwan, they go different places, they go looking for kids where they can have sex. And I would love a passport to tell me, this is an offender, he's coming into my country, he may be coming in to violate my children. And so, what I'd like to say is that recently, Senator Wademark asked, I think it was a written question to the Prime Minister, when the Tobago Children's Authority mentioned their recent statistics that they had 418 cases, I think it was. And Mr. Mark asked the question, how many of these were brought to justice? And even though he got a reply, we didn't get numbers. So, I'm still trying to say, is what we have working now, is it really working? Because you are getting figures coming in from the Children's Authority. So it's good statistics, but we want to see follow-through. I want to see results. I want to see 418. How many of those perpetrators are in prison? This is what I wanted to see. And I think Mr. Mark may have to ask that question sometime and hope he can get some statistics, because it'll give me a level of comfort that we are getting justice, we are getting not just statistics, but we are getting some follow-through for this. Now, some global figures would also show that 10 to 20% of females rape boys. So, and this is something even in our local figures we are saying that boys are being molested. So, as a warning, we have to look at the nannies, because even recently there was a case where a nanny was caught having oral sex with a 4-year-old boy. The mother found it out. What do we do? How do we protect this? How do we put things in place? There's the nanny cams. There's, should government give us a tax break for this? Because if it's so prevalent, I think sometimes people with kids who have to go to work, and they need to be educated that the persons they leave their children with may be the ones to violate them. So you have to look out, not just for your workers, but sometimes you have to look out for your own husband. You have to look out for your new boyfriend. And I always warn patients when they say, Doc, I'm going on with my life. I have a new guy in my life. I'm so happy. Once they have daughters, well, now we have to say sons, eh? I warn them that that man could be going through you to get at your daughter. So you have to teach your daughter the proper, don't leave them alone home. Don't, you have to start educating these women. They are happy they're getting a new partner. Yeah. So I'm looking at the existing system we have. The existing system we have, you know, to me, there is a system where it's failing. The existing system is failing. And I think we may have to give a collective apology to all those persons waiting for justice, and also reach out to all those being raped and ravaged by their relatives' home. So therefore, we have to get something to work. And this, again, is a challenge to the Attorney General to get a system to work, right? So somehow we need to put mechanism in place, some sort of mechanism in place that we could reach to those persons. Now, there are cases where the victim may not want to come forward, right? And I see challenges here, challenges where to get somebody to come and say, listen, my father is molesting me. The mother may not believe, that if it's a stepfather, even a real parent. And I have a case where this girl, they came from a good Christian background. What happened to her is the father used to bathe her, and she found all of a sudden the father now, somehow just focusing on one part of her body. The mother went to a church function, and then he started to, he molested the girl at that moment when the mother went to a church function. Now that girl, when she came to me years after, I said, but what went on in your mind? Why you didn't tell your moms what went on? She said, because Daddy told me that in the Bible, Cain and Abel, there were not many people, there were just that family. So in her father warped that child's mind and told the child that in the Bible, there was Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and obviously they would have probably, how did they procreate? So the father utilized the Bible to get at that girl's mind. He utilized the Bible to tell the girl that, listen, if you tell mommy, mommy will separate from me because she doesn't understand that. So then that girl felt guilty that if I speak out to my mother and tell my mother what's going on, I will cause my parents to break up. So she couldn't talk. She was trapped there, and she was caught in emotion. The love for her father, who she loved for, she reached, it was 8 years old when he started molesting her. So as a child, happy 8 years old, years in the future, she turned a bipolar disorder patient, walking the road naked and sour, talking, hearing things at 24 years age. And when we went into it, this what happened. You see, what happened, the love of and the respect of the dad who's protected me, that love emotion collided with the hate emotion. I hate this man, what he's doing me, he's violating me. And the fear. And when all these emotions mixed, it created this mental illness in this girl. But her horror story didn't end there. To escape from the daddy, she would have gone by her cousin, her girl cousin, to play with. And one day when she went by her girl cousin, her uncle gave both of them Benadryl cough mixer to drink, made them knock out, and she found her uncle on top of her. So the horror stories are there. So when I see patients like this, and the Attorney General comes with a bill like this, I am very, very tempted to give him my full support, because I've been knocking on doors to get some better support for the children, some sort of recognition to let the children be empowered, to know about good touch, bad touch. I have also, in that way, tried to tell teachers, to train teachers to look out for these kids. And, I'm looking, at ways that we could get these children out of the closet, get them to come out, get them to speak out. And when I have patients who come to me, I always look at them and say, listen, talk, get it out your chest. But there's hope. I always look at Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey, she was raped at the, from 9 years, sorry.
I understand that you've created the context using your professional background as well, as most senators have done in this particular debate. But at this point in time, as you're moving forward, you need to speak specifically to the bill that is before us that is prescribing a solution to the issue. So what you've been doing, and you've rightly done so, is create the context of what the issue is and giving examples based on your professional background. The bill prescribes a particular solution and a pathway to sort of treat with that. And I would like you to use the bill and the clauses in the bill and make your points going forward from that standpoint.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I look at the bill and I see mainly three problems, right? The law only gets a minority, and most of us are not seen and suffer in silence. I also look at the fact that, you know, that we are trying to get the delays in the system. We are trying to improve, you know, the system, and I have to plead with the Attorney General to ensure that the staff is beefed up in the Children's Authority, in the DPP's office, and all these offices who deal with these children. And Senator Amin spoke about the rape trauma syndrome. So I would just like to say that, yes, that exists, post-traumatic stress, you know, anxiety, panic attacks. Senator Bertice Primer spoke about, you know, that she looked at the fact that the sexual harassment policy is being, you know, somehow you're bringing that into focus. And this is something that, you know, I'm sure the women of the nation would be very grateful for this. Yes, and this is what I'm saying. This is an excellent piece of legislation because the woman needs protection. So therefore, this bill before us, we looked at certain aspects of this bill, and I'm looking at the fact that most of these attacks occur in the victims' homes, taxis, beach, you know, different areas. We're looking at the fact that the entire life of these victims can take a turn. Most of the vulnerable ages between 7 and 13. And I'm looking at, is this bill going to help us in any way curb the crime? Will the naming and the shaming of these sexual offenders be able to somehow, you know, ease that trauma I'm seeing out there, to make more people come to life? And I heard on, you know, different opinions on this side. The rights of the individual will be infringed in terms of the rights of privacy, the rights of, you know, of the individual in terms of movement, and I heard also the minister, you know, Senator Rambarat speak about the issue in Australia and also in North America. So, you know, you're getting different opinion. You know, some say that, you know, it's on the way out, this Megan's Law and the registrar, while we got on the other side, someone for it. So what I'm looking at is that I think that, you know, if we want to name and shame, I have no problem with that. And I honestly don't have any problem with that because I've seen the level of hurt among my patients, and I'm thinking, well, how will this help them? How will the naming and shaming help them? So I am for it. I'm for the registry. I'm for publishing it. But it's two issues I look at. Because part of the act actually mentioned that when you are going to, you know, name and shame that person, you have to have the name, the offense. So for instance, I think it's clause, let me see here, I can get it here. So the act actually looked at the I think it's section, let me see here. No, I think I have it here. This one. Where it actually stated to name the offense. So it actually stated that, you know, besides naming the name, the address, and also other information, it was saying you should actually have the offense placed there. Now, I have a little problem with this because, yes, I don't mind having a name place that, hey, this is a sexual offender. But I wouldn't know if he actually went in for prostitution, went in for exhibitionism, went in there for, whatever disorder. I wouldn't like it there to be noted that he went in there for molesting his daughter. Because you see, if you are in a home and one daughter is molested by a father, and then that father is in this registry, and his name is there, all the other daughters there will be stained. People will say, look, that house, all those girls, they're molested. Whilst if you do not have the listing of the crime, just a sexual offender, I don't know what he's there for. He could have gone to one of those brothels, but putting him down as a sexual offender would not only affect the person who was molested, but anybody in that home. So I think we need to look at, when we are placing that, I am hoping that we may have to, look at deleting that aspect of it where they ask for the actual named offense, just for the protection of the other females in the home. Another thing I look at is, we looked at the fact that how could we get these children to come out? And there's a blue teddy bear pins that people may see with a bandage. And it's really an NGO that, Break the Silence. It was an NGO, and they actually had that movement since 2008, and UNICEF actually adopted it from Trinidad in 2012. So those are systems that we need to push. We need to get a child to come forward. We also look at the fact that, I actually attended with an NGO called Aspire. 10 years ago, we went to a school and we were teaching children sexual education. And it was a drama. And we didn't do it in school. We actually did it in the university. And a Catholic school won the prize. But when it was time to get the prize, they said they are not allowed to get it because it was on sexual education. So we are faced with difficulties like that when we are trying to educate our children. I say we have to break those barriers because, it is something that we have to move ahead and see as much as possible. If the parents cannot teach sexual education, we may have to say, we have to put the sexual education in school. Children's safety, I think, is paramount. Some senators mentioned Megan's Law, and even before, I think it was, Senator Haynes looked at the Jacob Wetterling crime, where that individual, was, I think, killed and raped, I think, and the police officer said if they only knew, that child would have been saved. In Megan's Law, too, it was a 7-year-old girl raped, killed, and the offender had 2 previous convictions, and he was living across the street. Now, I would love to have a list of offenders in the sense that if I'm going to hire someone in my children's school, being in the PTA, and he's going to clean the bathroom, I want to know who is this individual, what sort of history he has. Does he have any sort of offense that I need to look out for? I personally would feel more comfortable in looking at this. But you see, we have to appreciate this problem of child abuse. It's a global problem. If you remember, in South Africa, up to recently, a 7-year-old was raped in a restroom in a popular restaurant. So, yeah.
1 second. Again, you're focusing on the problem itself, and the bill speaks to a legislative solution. So as much as that context has been created, you have to remember this late stage of the debate where you're coming in, a lot of context would have been created going forward by every single senator. Sure. And you have properly done so in relation to your professional background already for the most of your contribution. So at this point, if you can point to specific clauses in the bill that you may want to make a contribution on that is not repetitive of what has been said before, then I invite you to do so now.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It's just I wanted to catch the ear of the AG to tell him, I think with this legislation he needs to do more. and why I wanted to say he needs to do more in terms of, more in terms of the punishment meted out. Not just a registry, because in India there was a case in BBC News. India introduces death penalty for child rapists. He may need to consider that. It was 21st of April 2018, BBC News. And, it was a grim case. 17 men raped an 11-year-old girl over several weeks in a flat. She had hearing disability. So the Attorney General will need to look at, is the legislation working? Do we need to go a little, on the side that, I may be more on the side of a stronger sort of legislation, not just the registrar. So this is why I was hoping the Attorney General could look at what transpires elsewhere. And I would like to, I don't know if you'll allow me to address Senator Hussein's comment where he was asking about the root causes of why people have this offense.
You have the right to reply to any senator who's raised a particular issue in the debate, but you can do so pretty shortly. You don't make that the larger part of your contribution.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. So Senator Hussein asks, why do people rape kids? Why do men go with children? And very quickly, I'll say some men have low self-esteem. They feel a child cannot judge their sexual prowess. Some individuals may be attractive to the body changes at puberty. Some may be a pedophile, as Senator Vera said, it's 1% in the population, and they just cannot help it. They're just attracted to children who are prepubescent. So they are not even attracted to a child that is going into puberty and developing. And those, right now, society is looking, is this a sort of an alternate lifestyle? Eh? This is the trend that is happening in some countries, that they're looking at pedophilia as that. Some people go with a child because there's less chance of getting STD. The child has not been infected. Some fathers say that, she's developing now, she's going with boyfriend, I will break out now. Those are some of the societal reasons why these things happen. Some father may be abused as a child. Some of them have a crazy power trip. And sometimes they use, I think Senator Rambarat mentioned that some girl was getting ready for school, and her father was drunk. So some people, they may have the thoughts of doing an act to their child, but the alcohol will cause a disinhibited behavior, and then they act out on it. So the thought is there, and they think about it, and it manifests. How I could do this, how I could do that, and the alcohol, as the case he mentioned. Huh? Well, the thought is there, and they may think that, hey, I could go after my daughter, but when they use the alcohol, they have nothing to hold them back. They're not, they are what they call disinhibited. So it's easier for them to go on and do it. So alcohol has a part to play. And in the discourse that he gave about that situation, the father was smelling of alcohol. So it has a part to play in some instances. Some of them look at children as easy target. Some say virgin cleansing. There are different reasons. Revenge for the wife. There was cases where a mother and father was going to separate. And the father said, well, this is your daughter. She's the object of your love. Let me rape the daughter. So there are a lot of reasons. So whatever reasons they have, Senator was saying, we have to see it's a whole host of reasons, and we have to see how we could hold it in place. Senator Vera, Senator Choate, Senator I talked about pornography, which fuels the molester. Again, they have to look at how could we look at better control. And I want to look at Clause 7 of the Act, where, it binds the state, to act in certain cases. And this reminds me of a case in Rotherham, North English Town, an incident that occurred where, I got it from a book, Peter McLaughlin, Easy Meat, Inside Britain, Grimy Gang Scandal, where it was the failure of the authorities from 1980 to 2010. They knew that what was going on in their town. They knew for 10 years that certain gangs were grooming girls, carrying them out, getting sexual, having them for sex. And they knew that, and they didn't act. But this Clause 7, I must praise the AG if it's there, and I find out there's a restaurant in Crib that is hiding underage girls, I may take an action to the state and say you have to act under Clause 7. Because, you know, we see things, and sometimes the state may just sit back and do nothing. The machinery of the state may not be well oiled. Sure. Right. Again, I look at cases where, you know, practical cases, you know, the right to disclose was given. We have to disclose, you said. But there's a case where a doctor said, this girl came into the office, and she was pregnant, and she wanted an abortion, and she was underage. And the doctor said, you have to go and report this. I have to report it to the police. And she showed her a picture of a guy with big, thick gold chain, gold teeth, and 2 guns. I said, that is short man, you know. If you go and report it, short man will come for you. So therefore, that doctor did not report it. Will she be guilty? I mean, it's her life there is going to be threatened, but it's either her life, but she was shown a picture of this guy called Shortman who would come after her. Another practical problem we faced, 17-year-old girl came to get contraception. What should I do? You know, if she's having sex, I'm supposed to report it. But look at the dilemma. If I don't report it, or if I tell her leave my office, she may get pregnant. She may add to the statistics of 2,500 teenage pregnancies that occur a year. So again, you know, I would be charged. I could be charged. You know, so certain members spoke about the changes in the register infringing the rights of the individual. But I am looking at this register, and I say, and they even spoke about the, you know, the rate of recidivism. They say, you know, we're not getting what we really wanted. These people still committing crime. But, you know, to really get the rates down, the best thing is castration. If that is what we are doing, the best thing is castration. 8 states, you know, in the, you know, California, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Montana, Texas, they do chemical castration, not surgical castration, chemical castration. So you give an injection and you cut down the level of these guys having. So the so then, you know, you have the rates actually, chemical castration, the recidivism rates fall from 50% to 5%. And I'm saying, even if you're thinking about parole and other things that, you know, Senator Mark, we have to see, could we do that? Denmark, Sweden, Turkey, Indonesia, Russia, Germany, France, all these countries do that.
The Senator doesn't have very much more time to wrap up his contribution, but it's getting a little loud. So could we just temper the tone in the chamber so I can hear the Senator wrap up? Senator, continue.
The AG mentioned that there are so many people in prison, so probably we can use this chemical castration to get people out. But don't put them back in their homes. Put them back in other homes. They could still continue working, still earn their money, as somebody mentioned about breadwinner, supply it to their home, but not to be in contact. So this is something we have to look in that context. If you're talking about parole, do we utilize this tool, medical tool? We have to remember, too, that you know, the persons may come in all shapes and sizes, and even in the Catholic Church, when it was disclosed by the amount of persons, the amount of priests who actually had abused children, they kept it hidden. The paid off people kept it hidden. And it's only when movements called SNAP came forward, Survivors Network for those abused by priests, when they had the list of priests published, more people came on board. So this is why I'm saying if we get a list published, more persons may come on board. What I'm saying is if we are going to publish that list, it should be under the discretion of the judge too. Because you see, the judge and the victim may have to say, do we put somebody on that list? Because if you have to ask, the victims may not come forward, but if they know, my father is not on that list. So I'm saying give some discretionary powers to the judge and the victim to meet to say who will go on that list, because some victims may not be able to come forward, may not want to come forward for this. So in closing, I would like to say that there was a case in Hackney, East London, where a 14-year-old girl was raped by 7 teenagers, and the judge actually lifted the order for naming and shame, and he allowed those minors to be named because they were boys, 15-year-old boys, you know, and he's at 30, and he said he's going to lift that. So again, the discretion may have to be there between the judge and, I say, who can we name, who can we put on the register. I thank Senator Paula Gopi-Schoon for reminding us of Manu Benjamin, and I think...
Time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Phillips.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice President and everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to join this debate. An act to amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128. As a criminologist and an educator, this topic is very important to me, very significant. And I would like to take this time to congratulate, or commend rather, the Honorable Attorney General and his team for the work being done. As many of the points I wanted to speak on have already gone, I will be touching briefly on a few. I'll start with education, and I will simply mention that education regarding sexual offenses, whether it be abuse, incest, or any other form of violence, must be broad-based, where we start with our preschoolers. Research has shown that although preschoolers from the age of 3 are deemed incapable of understanding, once they can comprehend the language you're speaking to them, you can modify what you're saying so that they understand, as the Honorable Senator just mentioned, good touch, bad touch, and you start them from there, and then you phase how much you educate as the children grow. Education of parents is also important at a community level and at an individual household level. This is important because sometimes we are here trying to amend laws that we hope would help the general population, but in individual homes, there are persons that have their unique beliefs. So if we do not take into context and respect and show that we understand that some persons may be aware of the laws, but respectfully agree to disagree, then we will not be addressing everyone and solving the issue on a real level. Research has also shown that in instances of education, having an expert come into classrooms or into schools or into homes and communities to teach persons about sex education is not as effective as if we have teachers who are already known by the children and the community doing that work. So my suggestion is to have all our teachers trained in sex education, and then they bring the message. All right. Children also have a unique ability to form a bond with a teacher that will allow them to reveal if anything is going amiss, whether in their homes or there at school, etc. This brings me to my second point. Most of the points that I'm talking about here generally will come from Part 3 of the bill. My question is, what is being put in place to protect persons who intervene or who try to assist in cases of incest or sexual abuse, or if they are told about any sexual misconduct and then they want to support the person by helping them report it? There's an instance in Tobago, where I'm from, where a school teacher was observing her class. The children were playing, and one child in particular was saying some things and drawing some things that she found to be very concerning. Upon investigation, well, chatting with the child, she was able to recognize that it was a case of incest. The child was having a sexual relationship with her father. She addressed it to the principal. The police got involved, and the child was removed from the home. I don't remember exactly what happened, but the father of the child was released on bail, and he came to the school, entered the classroom, and stabbed that teacher to death. So that has remained with me throughout my years. And it is a concern for me that when persons intervene, especially persons who are teachers, who are in the situation where they can see and observe children on a day-to-day basis and can note changes in these children's behaviors, When they find this information, where do they go with it, and who protects them? Another point, the role of the media. When information is made available to the media, whether on this registry or from the police, even if the story is sensational, you know it will bring big headlines, persons will be very interested in reading it, we must remember that our victims, or the persons who would have experienced any sort of sexual violence or abuse or case of incest, are human beings who then have to live their life after the story. So as we go forward with this, I would appreciate if some attention be placed in or some limitations be made to what the media can say and publish. The details of a story, for instance, can be left out. Again, it is noteworthy at Senator Richards was making the point that some offenders should be evaluated by persons who are specialists, whether in psychiatry or clinical psychology, before being released back into the society. Not only must the community be educated and prepared for this reintegration of the offender who would have served his or her time, but these offenders must be specifically evaluated, and I agree with Senator Richards, on an as-needed basis, whether it be 3 months or 6 months, but some of them also should not be released at all. I say that to say some persons are psychopaths. Yes, I'm going back to my criminology, psychology background here, but we have psychopaths who walk among us in our society, and they are incapable of being rehabilitated. So spending time with them in group sessions or speaking to a therapist will not change their behavior. One of the things we know about psychopaths is that they actually enjoy these therapy sessions because it is another opportunity for them to manipulate. So being released back into society where they are going to return to their previous behavior would not be the ideal thing at all. So having evaluations done so that we can identify persons who have psychopathic tendencies, and there are measures and tests that can be done to assist us in identifying these persons. Once they're identified, they must not be released back into society. And my final point, of course, would be the involvement of universities in research. In order for us to have real data or empirical evidence to then inform policy, research must be done. And we have our universities here. We have USC, we have UE, we have CUSTAT. And the students there, especially in the social sciences departments, must engage in research as part of their degree. So I would urge persons who have the power to give grants to the universities or even to just engage these students to have them do research that can then be used to inform the policies that we then use or engage. All right, and with that, I thank you all.
Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on an act to amend the Sexual Offences Act. Mr. Vice President, throughout the debate, over and over, those who are listening to us and watching us are hearing about this term, about a registrable offense. And though we understand here, because we have the legislation before us, what is a registrable offense, by virtue of the sections that we are dealing with, the offenses under the Sexual Offences Act, sections 16, 17, 18, 19, and 23 of the Trafficking in Persons Act, and the offenses under parts 4, 6, and 8 of the Children's Act. I think it's important for those who are listening to us to understand that these offenses that we speak about are rape, grievous sexual assault, sexual intercourse with a female under 14 years, sexual intercourse with a female between 14 and 16, sexual intercourse with a male under 16, incest, sexual intercourse with an adopted minor, sexual intercourse with a minor employee, sexual intercourse with mentally subnormal person. These are very, very serious offenses. And I would have thought, Mr. Vice President, that this week, that the Attorney General would have accepted the invitation of the opposition to work on this piece of legislation in a joint select committee. More so this week, because this week we saw the fruition of the work of the government, the opposition, and the independent bench in having our first judge-alone trial in this country. And that was a piece of legislation. That was a piece of legislation that I recall very, very vividly, that when we had almost finished the debate, because of the contributions that were made, it was Senator Mark who had stood and suggested that we have a special select committee with respect to that piece of legislation that was chaired by the Honorable Minister of Agriculture. And we saw in a very short space of time, we can reap the fruits of that labor in relation to that first judge-alone trial in our country. And I think if we put our heads together, Attorney General, Madam President, through you to the Attorney General, I am sure that we can come together, work together, and as a parliament, collectively put our minds together to come up with a piece of legislation that I think will be to the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, in this particular case, the victims, the accused, and the general public with respect to the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill. And I implore the Attorney General to take up our invitation with respect to that offer that we made. Madam President, this is a very, very important debate and a very important piece of legislation because, as the Attorney General indicated at the outset, this is a piece of legislation that requires a special majority. It requires the support of the opposition. And in these types of debates, more so than in ordinary primary legislation, what we are asked to do is have a heightened degree of scrutiny with respect to the clauses that we are asked to pass as a parliament, because it is presumed under the constitutional model that we operate under that what is proposed will directly intrude upon the fundamental rights that are guaranteed under Section 4 and 5. And in those circumstances, Madam President, just for the sake of completeness, having looked at the section, this piece of legislation would, in my respectful view, intrude upon 4A, 4B, 4C, 4I, 4G, and 4F of the fundamental rights that are guaranteed under Section 4 and 5. Madam President, a lot has been said about consultation and about education, but there is one point that I think has not been made, and I think it's a very, very important point, which is this. If we ask ourselves, in the rural areas of our country, where many of these offenses take place, how many persons, how many of our citizens in the rural areas understand what is the Sexual Offences Act? How many of them understand that there's a Children's Act? How many of them understand what is sexual grooming? How many of them understand when something wrong is done to them or their children, where they are to go to in order to get help? And in that context, Madam President, I want to suggest through you to the Honorable Attorney General that a very, very useful suggestion would be that the education that is done in relation to this particular piece of legislation incorporate the Ministry of Local Government. And why I say that, Madam President, is this. In most of these rural areas, perhaps the one person that is very familiar with the types of actions that take place, the incest, the rape, sexual intercourse with minors, are the councillors and the aldermen. They are the people who are on the ground, sometimes more so than the police officers. They are perhaps the one group of people that will be able to relate in a personal way with victims and be able to bring to the attention of the authorities. Because in many of these cases, like many people have said in this debate, the problem is really getting the victims to report what is happening to them. Part of that problem is that they simply just don't know. And so, Madam President, as part of my contribution, I would like to ask, through you to the Attorney General, to work this piece of legislation together with the Minister of Local Government, have meetings in the different regional corporations, and educate the councillors and the aldermen as to what the Act is meant to do, what the offences are, and let them also help the government, let them help the police, let them go out there on the ground, let them have cottage meetings, and let them educate the people in the villages and in the rural communities as to what is unlawful, what they can do, and where they can get help. I think that will take us a long way in trying to bring life to this particular piece of legislation. But while I say that, Madam President, that is one extreme. That is the extreme in the far-off areas where we always seem to use as the examples where you talk about sexual offences and these types of offences against children. But we must also understand, Madam President, that the type of action, the type of conduct that we seek to prohibit by this type of legislation, there is another extreme. There is another extreme where people in high office commit the kinds of offences that we seek to prohibit by these pieces of legislation, under the Sexual Offences Act, under the Trafficking in Persons, under the Children's Act, and under the Children's Act in particular. And you know why that is so, Madam President? Because they have the power to do it. They have the power to use the opportunity to give a job in a high office to people to take advantage of them. They have the power to use institutions because they have that institutional power to be able to take our young girls and our young boys and employ them for what purpose? And why nobody will say anything? Because of who they are and where they sit. Right next door here, Madam President, in the Hyatt, you could see them on a weekend. Security entourage parked up in front. Just go to the back and you'll see it taking place. Wide open. Movie town, same thing. Security entourage in front. And why are we ashamed to say who they are and what they do? That is part of what we are called upon to do here. Everybody talked about name and shame. Let us not be ashamed to name. So, before going more into any contextual conversation, Madam President, let me get into the provisions of this very important piece of legislation. Madam President, through you to the Honourable Attorney General, I think a very, very useful and very well thought out contribution was made by Dr. Dillon-Remy with respect to her interpretation of the new Section 35 and her concerns. But let me take that conversation one step further. Section 35(1) deals with where a person is charged with a registrable offence. The court shall make an order requiring that person to be medically examined for the purpose of determining whether the person is suffering from a sexually transmitted infection. To take the argument that Dr. Remy indicated one step further, what is a sexually transmitted infection needs to be defined, because as it stands now, one doesn't know exactly what that is. It's not a legal term of art, so it has to be defined. So somewhere in the definition section, we need to define what is a sexually transmitted infection. But medically examined in the provision, medically examined by whom? Who is going to medically examine this person? Is it somebody who's qualified under the medical board? You just can't leave it as wide as this, Madam President, to say that the legislation says that the court shall make an order requiring the person to be medically examined. In a public institution, in a private institution, we just don't know. There is a sense where you are and what this particular clause is doing, because when you go to clause 2, it becomes even more draconian, because where a person who is required to be medically examined pursuant to subsection 1 does not consent to the medical exam, he may be medically examined without his consent. So when the court makes this order, the question that I want to ask is, how is this going to be operationalized? The court makes this order, an order is made, an order is generated by the court. How is this going to be put into action? Who is the authority that is going to ensure that this person is going to be medically examined? When they refuse, how is this going to be carried out? what degree of, Senator Hussain indicated about reasonable force. Well, what degree of force? Where? At the private institution? At the public institution? At the prison? There's a lot that needs to be worked out, Madam President, with respect to these particular provisions. And there is a lot of case law. I have it here. I'm not going to go into them individually. But there is a lot of case law about this idea. Because what you are doing, this particular section, is authorizing somebody. We've not defined who that person is. But this section is authorizing somebody to commit an assault on an individual. It's going to be lawful because it's permitted by law. But the point about it is that we have to define who it is and in what circumstances and where you are going to affect the liberty of the subject. You have to be able to have that done in particular well-defined parameters. Otherwise, you will run afoul of the law being arbitrary. Where an examination conducted in accordance with subject law reveals that the person examined is found to be suffering from a sexually transmitted infection, information to that effect shall immediately be communicated to the person examined, the virtual complainant, and a representative. And then we go on in subsection 5 to say that subject to 3, the results of any examination conducted in accordance with subsection 1, 2, or 4 shall be confidential. But, Madam President, this is not the register we're dealing with here. So where is this information going to be collected? Where is it going to be stored? Who is going to have access to it? Under what conditions is access going to be given? And like Senator Dillon-Remy indicated, this is all being done in the circumstances of a person who is charged but not yet convicted. So we don't know where this information is going to be stored and who is going to have access to it. But what I want to focus in with some detail, Madam President, is 35.6. Because 35.6 deals with an examination being conducted in accordance with 4. This is for a virtual complainant of a registrable offense. And the virtual complainant is found to be suffering from a sexually transmitted infection. Well, I've already said with respect to that, we need to define that. Which the virtual complainant may reasonably have contracted from the person examined under subsection 1 and 2. The High Court may, upon an application by the virtual complainant or a representative where they are dead, being satisfied on a balance of probabilities that the virtual complainant contracted the infection as a result of the commission of the offense for which the person was examined, has been convicted, order the person convicted of the offense to pay compensation. Now, let me just put this in context to understand the problems with this. The Attorney General has said we have 149 people in the High Court with cases over 10 years, 24 in the Magistrate Court with cases over 11 years. Look how this section is structured, Madam President. One assumes that this test that has to be conducted is going to be conducted soon after the person is charged. So the person is charged, these tests are being conducted. But the right that is given under subsection 6, which is the right to apply to the High Court, is conditional upon the person being convicted. So you get charged in the year 2001, your case come up in the year 2011, which is 10 years later. You are convicted, and then you have to come and face a civil suit 11 years later for compensation, the way this is structured. So let's dismantle this now with the problems. This is giving a right to sue. Right now, someone will have a common law right to sue. The statute now overrides the common law. That in law is presumed that the common law right is eclipsed. So what is the limitation period for bringing this action? And when does the limitation period start? Because there is a comparison between this legislation under the sections later on. Subsection 36 says that a virtual complainant of a registrable offense is also eligible for relief under Section 29 of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act. So I went to that act. In that act, under Section 32, it says, no compensation shall be paid unless the application is made within 1 year after the date of the injury or death, or after the date upon determination by the board that good cause exists for the delayed application. So where is the limitation period in this? Is it that somebody can come 20 years after somebody has been convicted and bring an action and say, I've now found out this is the position? It can't work like that, Madam President. It will not work. It will be unworkable. This is not a tort or a contract. This is a statutory right that you are giving to someone to bring an action for compensation. And therefore, there is another issue that arises out of that. But I must suggest to the Attorney General that we need to put some kind of limitation period in so that there can be some limit to what the virtual complainant can do. So we get down to the issue now of order the person convicted of the offense to pay compensation to the virtual complainant or his representative. So you have this right to go to the High Court to get compensation pursuant to this section. It's a statutory right. It's not a common law right. So what is the purpose of this compensation that is being given? Is it that it is supposed to be general in nature so that the normal compensatory grounds are going to work? Or is it, as the legislation may suggest, that this is some kind of punitive power that is being given to the High Court to deal with it? Well, Madam President, the Attorney General will be very familiar with the fact that if it is that we are going to give the High Court this power under Section 35, subsection 6, to order compensation, the first thing that we should do is define on what basis this compensation is going to be given. Because as it stands here, right, as I see it, the compensation in this has to be highly punitive because it's somebody who's spreading a sexually infected disease. And if that is the position, normal common law compensatory principles for a compensatory award will not work. So there are limited circumstances in which a High Court can give compensation outside of normal compensatory principles. So that is what we refer to as exemplary damages. Now, you could only award exemplary damages in 3 different situations. And those situations will not arise in this, 2 of them will not arise in this case. So if it is that that is what we are proposing to do, then we need to amend Section 6 to indicate that a person who applies for compensation under subsection 35(6), the court has the power to award exemplary damages that will achieve the benefit of deterrence and punishment at the same time, because that is what I think we are designing us here to do. And the third category upon which you can award exemplary damages is by statute. It has to be by statute. The court has no common law power to do that. And therefore, I suggest to the Attorney General that we put in another section there that deals with the award of exemplary damages. We could call it another name if we wish. We've had the term vindicatory damages. We could find some other name for it, but we must indicate that that is the position the court is given a special power. Now, Madam President, this information that is supposed to be confidential, this information, I already indicated, we don't know where it is going to be and who is going to have access to it. And therefore, we have to put in some kind of guideline, some kind of subsection to say where this information is going to be. How is the information going to be transmitted from the person who is carrying out the medical examination to where it is going to be stored? Is it going to be reported back to the court? When it is reported back to the court, is it that all the court staff are going to have access to it, like court records? Or how is it that we are going to enforce this confidentiality? Because this does not relate back to the provisions, the confidentiality provisions of Section 55, unless we indicate who it is. So there is a section at Section 55 that is a catch-all kind of omnibus provision that says a person involved in the administration of this part shall keep all facts, information, and records obtained or furnished under this act confidential, except insofar as this part or any written law permits the person. And a person who contravenes this section commits an offense liable on summary conviction of $75,000 and to imprisonment for 10 years. Madam President, with the greatest, the best, the most generous interpretation, I don't think anybody's personal information in this kind of environment where you are dealing with somebody's medical records, that $75,000 as a limit to a penalty for this kind of breach is one, it is appropriate. I think it's far too low for the protection of somebody's privacy in these circumstances. So let's go to section 36.1, 36.2, and 36.3. This is in relation to clause 10 of the bill, and here again, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, where a person is convicted of a registrable offense, the virtual complainant may also apply to the court for compensation, and the court shall order that the convicted person pay compensation to the virtual complainant. Now, as it stands now, the court has certain powers to award compensation as it presently stands. We have to understand whether this is in addition to those powers or whether this is a separate cause of action that we are giving again. A virtual complainant, well, that deals with section 29 of the Criminal Injuries Compensation, and where an order for compensation to the virtual complainant is made in a court, and the virtual complainant seeks further compensation in another court, the court that awards further compensation shall take into account the amount of compensation already ordered, where the court makes a further order. Well, you see, Madam President, I have a difficulty with this particular provision in relation to 36 subsection C, because it says where an order for compensation to a virtual complainant is made in a court, and the virtual complainant seeks further compensation in another court. It just doesn't speak to the way in which litigation is conducted, Madam President, because what you have here again, anybody who is convicted of a sexual offense has a cause of action in civil law as we presently stand. So it has to be, it cannot be in addition to. It has to be defined, and we must say in the legislation whether this is in addition to other remedies that are available as they stand. Because what you are doing again is providing a statutory cause of action to a cause of action that exists at common law now. And what you will be doing is, whereas you are thinking you are giving the person some kind of benefit to be able to go to court and get compensation, what you might be doing by a side wind is taking away the right that you have now to go to court at common law. And somebody's going to take that point, and then we're going to realize that by a side wind, we've eclipsed the power of somebody to go to court in a civil action as it stands now. And the same criticisms that, and I don't want to put them as criticisms, but the same view that I've offered with respect to 35 subsection 6 is the same thing that we have to do with 36 subsection 1, 2, and 3, because you have to define what it is you're doing. And in 36, where it is you're dealing with the virtual complainant convicted of a registrable offense, the aim and the purpose, the mischief of the legislation has to be similar to that is set out in 35. And therefore, Madam President, through you to the Honorable Attorney General, it has to be, again, that you provide an explanation as to what we are seeking to do and how it is that the court, upon what basis the court is going to make these awards for compensation, and in doing so, whether the court is going to have the power, as I suggest, put in a subsection 4, and give the court the power to award punitive damages in those circumstances. You see, Madam President, while reference is made to the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act, in that act itself, section 25, which deals with the way in which an application is to be made under this act, which has to be similar to the way an application has to be made under this act. There are 5 subsections that govern how the application is going to be made. So how is it that under the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act, you have these provisions as to how the application is going to be made? We come here doing a similar thing. You make reference to the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act. You give a right to get compensation, but there is no statutory underpinning as to how this application is to be made and what are the powers that are to be exercised. And we may well wish, Madam President, to look at section 25 of that particular piece of legislation, because it actually sets out in determining whether or not to pay compensation, consideration shall be given to these factors. And then it says the nature of the injury suffered, whether there was any, and listen to these factors, Madam President. The nature of the injury suffered, whether there was any provocation by the victim, whether the victim or dependent cooperated with the police and prosecutors in the investigation and the prosecution of the case. There are factors that will trigger the discretion of the court in exercising the powers that are given here. And therefore, I suggest, Madam President, that we borrow from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Act to be able to strengthen the legislation with respect to this Section 35 and this Section 36. Now, Madam President, it is clear that the work that has been done to bring this piece of legislation to where it is today, from where it was in the year 2000, has been considerable. The 2000 legislation built upon the Administration of Justice Act that was passed in 1996. And as we go along and build on this work in progress to try and find the best way possible to deal with the mischief that this piece of legislation is meant to treat with, we have to find ways, Madam President. One speaker, I can't remember who it is, spoke about the fact that people are not going to come forward in relation to sexual offenses unless they are confident that there will be some kind of success in relation to prosecutions and detection. The problem that we have is that the detection rate is low, the prosecution rate is low, the conviction rate is even lower. And therefore, when one person has to ask, right, should I put myself through the agony of 10 years or 11 years to be able to finally get some nebulous concept called justice at the end of the day? Will that encourage people to come forward? In the material that we've been provided by the NGOs, they say 7%. 1 out of every 7 people come forward. And what are we going to do when we pass this legislation today, or when we pass this legislation eventually as a parliament? Is it going to encourage more people to come forward, more victims to come forward, so that we could actually catch the offenders at the end of the day, come forward and report the crimes? One of the things that, and I know you don't wish me to go outside of the bill, Madam President, but I want to make a suggestion to the Attorney General. If it is that this legislation is put to a joint select committee, can we consider, Madam President, to the Attorney General, through you, could we consider having closed hearings so that at the end of the day, a victim doesn't have to come frontally and confront the accuser, which is one of the most intimidating things that prevent people from coming forward and be able to report, knowing that at some point in time, they have to go through not only the agony of reliving the same facts that you indicated in your opening, Attorney General, but they have to do it in front of the person who is charged with doing that to them. And that is perhaps the greatest disincentive for somebody to come forward who has been the subject of a sexual offense. I know, Madam President, in preparing for this debate, I remember what a former High Court judge had told me one day. He said, you know, the crime of murder is dead. You're dead when you are murdered. But they say when a sexual offense is committed against you, you're like the living dead. And that is what you have to deal with. And that is why we have to be careful. We have to be careful to balance the scales in this kind of legislation very carefully, Madam President. Because you know why? It is very easy to get up and speak in very emotional terms about this type of legislation. It is a very emotional topic. It is a topic that appeals to every single right-thinking citizen of our country. And because it is easy to become emotional about this, it is easy to fall on one side to the detriment of the other. We must be very, very mature in determining how we balance these rights, how we balance the rights of the victim to the rights of the accused. It is easy to take the side of the victim, you know. Just like we all say, we don't understand what it is like. We are fortunate enough to not be able to have been put in that position. You only understand it when one of your family members is involved. But you have to understand we are here to balance the rights not only from one side. We understand what we must do to protect society. We understand the policy of the legislation. But we have to be very careful that we strike the right balance. It is very easy to not strike the right balance in this kind of legislation. And it is easy, Madam President, when you make these arguments for somebody to say you're on the side of the criminals. is not about being on the side of the criminals. It is about being on the side of getting it right. And that is why we're saying we need to do the work to ensure that when we pass this legislation, it is what we want it to be, beneficial to the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, whichever side of the divide you fall on. Madam President, through you to the Honorable Attorney General, with respect to the clause 53 and the manner in which information may be expunged from the register. This type of legislation, Madam President, was subject to a lot of litigation all the way to the Supreme Court and to the European Court in the United Kingdom. And without going into the very details of it, there's a very, very important judgment from the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom in a matter called R on the application of F, which was a challenge under the same identical provisions that we have under Section 4, our privacy provisions, which mirrors Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And in that particular case, the respondents, meaning the applicants, were convicted sex offenders, subject to the same notification requirements that we have here under this piece of legislation that we proposed and the Attorney General proposed. And both of them brought claims for judicial review, claiming that the absence of a right of review of the requirements rendered them a disproportionate manner of pursuing a legitimate aim of preventing crime and thereby breached their rights to privacy protected by Article 8. And in that particular appeal that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Madam President, it is very, very important to put on the record what the court said. And it is this: it was common ground that the notification requirements interfered with the offender's right to privacy. These are almost the exact same provisions that we have here. That the interference was in accordance with law, and it was directed at the legitimate aims of the prevention of crime and protection of the rights and freedoms of others. The court had to consider three questions. What was the extent, and those are the same three questions we have to consider here. What was the extent of the interference with the Article 8 rights? How valuable were notification requirements in achieving the legitimate aims? And to what extent would the value be eroded if the notification requirements were made subject to review? And what the Supreme Court held in this matter, Madam President, was that the failure, let me tell you what it said. Accordingly, the courts below were correct to find that the notification requirements constituted a disproportionate interference with the Article 8 rights because they made no provision for the individual review of the requirements. And there are a number of cases. MAPA that went to the European Court set out what are the proportionate requirements that are required in these types of cases. And Madam President, what we need to do is to carefully look at the legislation. These cases deal with Section 53.
Senator Ramdeen, you have 5 more minutes.
I'm obliged, Madam President. There are a number of clauses in the legislation. Section 49. I wanted to highlight that Section 49, and there are about 3 sections that deal with the breaches of the provisions of the legislation, Madam President. And what I found a little bit, what I was concerned about is that you have different penalties for the different breaches, but the mischief that was sought, that the penalties are attracted to, do not seem to be very different. And therefore, it may well be that we may want to take a decision to make the penalties a little bit more uniform. Section 54 is another section that deals with the penalties. I have a real concern, Madam President, generally, and I understand why the Attorney General has placed the responsibility in the Office of the Commissioner of Police. But I have a real concern having regard to the state of the police service now, notwithstanding the attempts by the new Commissioner of Police to change the image and the way in which things are to be done, to allow the office of the Trinidad and Tobago, or the institution that is the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, to have custody of this kind of register. Because no matter what penalty you attach to a breach of the provisions of this Act with respect to the confidentiality of someone's personal information, no conviction, no fine, no restitution that could be given to someone who is subject to their privacy rights being breached could ever compensate them for the value of what they would have lost as a result. And all it takes is one individual to cause havoc, to release this kind of information into the public domain. And it's something that we have to guard against. Madam President, I think it goes without saying that everyone in this Parliament understands the need for this type of legislation. We understand the progress that has been made from the year 2000 to 2019. We understand the mischief that we seek to cure by these provisions and the establishment of a register. We understand what the Attorney General has sought to do in bringing this piece of legislation as being part of the package of the laws that are to improve the criminal justice system. But there is a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done with the legislation, and we are prepared to work with the government and to do the work to produce a piece of legislation that will pass constitutional muster and will be for the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And we will do that, Madam President, once we are given that opportunity. I give that undertaking on behalf of the opposition. I thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, I wish to sincerely thank each and every senator sitting in this honorable chamber for their most valuable and heartfelt contributions. Each and every member that has spoken in this debate has really given a very unique perspective. It was fulsome, it was positive, but insofar as it is both of those two things, it makes it almost a near impossibility to do justice to replying to the very many shades of argument that need to be addressed. So I ask honorable senators to please forgive me if I have generalized some of the issues in my response, and if I, in generalizing, don't do justice to the depth of the argument that was put forward. I want to thank Senator Ramdeen, as he was the last speaker, as equally as I wish to thank Senator Rambarat for their particular contributions, because I could easily have, certainly with Senator Rambarat, invited him to have done the closing of the debate, because I think he really gave a very fulsome response to a number of the issues up until that point in time. But Senator Ramdeen traversed a significant amount of the contribution which I would have put onto the record. I would have certainly read out what the first schedule items to the offences that are scheduled in the Sexual Offences Act look like, the proportionality argument, the traversing of the rights in the Constitution in Section 4 that this bill does certainly collide with. Senator Ramdeen put them very succinctly onto the record, and I thank him for it. Madam President, in terms of intricacy, this bill has a lot. I could right now spend an entire 40 minutes to just answer what Senator Ramdeen put on the record, because some of the positions offered by Senator Ramdeen are deserving of clarification, but it's not to say that they've not been thoughtfully put. For instance, the statutory period arguments, as we look to the positions, are there. We're looking at upon conviction, and one can rely upon the subsequent law amending the prior law. One could answer immediately that we're not infringing on the common law right towards damages, towards compensation, because the statutory right exists in the current Sexual Offences Act. The current Sexual Offences Act, for instance, in that which we propose to repeal, speaks about compensation in Section 34E. So I don't need to look to the common law, because the statutory provisions of the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, have that in the existing law right now. Certainly, interference by way of a mandatory medical examination and who keeps the records, that's in the existing law, Section 34E. I read, where a person is convicted of an offense under the sections to which this section applies, the court shall require that the person be medically examined. So a lot of what Senator Ramdeen is pointing out is in the existing law, and Senator Ramdeen is absolutely correct. Yes, the criminal injuries and compensation mechanisms can be replicated, but that's why we allow this law to prosper upon the back of subsidiary legislation. And that's why we specifically put in a provision that is contained in the proposed new section 56, that the minister may, section 57, that the minister may make regulations to give effect to the provisions of Part 3. That's exactly what we intended, because we didn't intend for the primary law to speak to the specifics. We intended for the subsidiary law to speak to the specifics. That's what I mean by the bill is intricate. There is a lot of thought that went into this, because we looked at the observed deficiencies of the 2000 amendments. We looked at the fact that the law was touched in 2012, but that the amendments weren't done. Now, I think that it's important in understanding some of the larger generalizations to also consider. Senator Hussain raised the very important point, well, do we need to put in the provisions to speak to use of force? And again, in demonstrating the intricacy of this law, I'd point out that the proposed section 45(6) specifically says that the sample taken without consent shall be done pursuant to section 13(1)(a) of the Administration of Justice Deoxyribonucleic Acid Act. In other words, then, we incorporated the use of force with reasonable force provisions in the law. So it may not be immediately apparent exactly how drilled down and detailed we were, but I want to assure you that the detail is here, that the understanding and perspective has been complicated, has been contemplated, as well as has been provided. So this law really requires an opportunity to be digested. That's why we took a full 9 months to get here. That's why we didn't just produce a bill and arrive here without consultation. And for the record, I wish to thank the members of the NGOs that did contribute. But I want to say that in speaking to one of the proponents for the NGO bodies, it's not true to say that we didn't consult with the persons named by the NGOs. That's not true. In fact, we received complaint on the earlier occasion that a whole body of members had not been consulted. At least in respect of one of them, I have a contribution which is multiple pages in length from an entity described in this contribution by the body of NGOs as not having contributed. Well, I say, without waving it to everyone, it's right here in my hands. Now, does that mean that there shouldn't be more consultation? I don't think that that means that. But I'd like to say that the opportunity to demonstrate the government's position has been, as you saw on the last occasion, Madam President, we didn't take this bill to conclusion on the last occasion. We are now, a week later, 9 months plus, nearly 10 months after, now wrapping up this bill. Why? There is merit to receiving the contributions on the floor of the Parliament. It provides an opportunity for members to crystallize their views and to give specific recommendations, as I welcome, for instance, those recommendations coming from all honourable senators, the last one being on the opposition side, Senator Ramdeen, who gave very critical consideration. Senator Dillon-Remy, I also listened carefully whilst I was juggling two matters and listened to your contribution, as I have to all members. But the position is that the consultation and the breadth of consultation and the depth of consultation that we have had does not necessarily preclude further consultation. For the record, I'd like to state that we did consult with the Commissioner of Prisons, the Office of the Prime Minister Gender Affairs, the Children's Authority, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, We also received submissions from the Law Association, from the Organization for Abused and Battered Individuals, and the Law Association, as I can certify, still being on their email list, sent it out to every single member of the Law Association, many of whom sit on the NGO organizations. One cannot have perfect consultation. One can have broad consultation. Certainly the government's intention was to facilitate the broadest form of consultation. We have, Madam President, a question to be asked. Why now? Why bring this legislation now? Why not have brought it sooner? I'd like to say, in raising this question and in providing an answer to that, it ties into one of the broad general contribution points of many senators. This law is not a panacea for all things related to sexual offenses. It would be folly to think that any one law could treat with that. That's not the intention of this law. That would mean that the volumes of laws of Trinidad and Tobago are irrelevant because one law ought to have everything. Surely this law articulates with other laws. The Criminal Injuries and Compensation Act, the Summary Courts Act, the Trafficking in Persons Act, the multiple statutes that exist, in particular the Children's Act, the Children's Authority legislation, child probation provisions, the criminal division law. It would be obtuse for the government to suggest that this one law was to treat with everything. And that broad concept of, are we doing enough to stop the generating phenomena that causes people to be registered? Because that's one of the themes here. How are we going to treat with the issue of the people who offend and the victims? And should this law provide for that? We dare say that this law ought not to specifically provide for that, but ought to be linked to other laws which provide for that. And that is why I must say, in asking the question that I did, that we've come now, we've come for this bill, we've come 10 months later in consultation because we have laid the ground in the following laws that treat with this law. The judges' rules for children, the children court rules, the multi-agency protocols formalizing the working interactions amongst agencies which play a role in dealing with children who are arrested, charged, and otherwise before the courts. The interagency protocols formalizing the working interactions between the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the ministry responsible for education for dealing with children who are arrested, charged, or otherwise before the courts. The child defense standards, the Trinidad Table of Equivalencies for the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, International Classification of Crime and Statistical Purposes, the Pair Resolution Framework and Rules, the Children Community Residences, Children Homes Regulations, the Child Rehabilitation Center Regulations, the Designation Orders, the Miscellaneous Provisions Act, by which we amended 13 laws treating with families and with children and with sexual offenses, the Child Rehabilitation Center Designation Orders, the Children Division, the Family and Children Division, which amended 19 laws treating with these very matters, the amendments to the Children's Act, the creation of training faculty at the Police Academy, the training of over 150 children and 60 adults in peer resolution, the creation of a child protection unit in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Force, the hiring and classification of all of the probation officers and child probation officers that go with this system. We came here to treat with this law to cause the register to be managed in the suggestions that we bring now after having done all of those things, honorable senators. So we certainly don't think that this one law ought to treat with all of those things. And we don't only tell you that, I have just recited what we have done already. So I'm not raising an hypothetical. I am raising the reality of what this government has done in operationalizing the laws and mechanisms. And dare I say, prior to this government coming into office, I can say with certainty that the only law on the landscape for a very long time that did as much but was not operationalized was the Children's Act of 2012. I'll remind, not by way of boof or suggestion or push, nobody on the opposition bench supported that law. Sorry, independent bench supported that law. Nobody. Because two immovable fixtures presented themselves in that law, which I respect and understand. One, there was a call that they would not support the Children's Act because of the presence of child marriage still in this country. And two, there was a call that they would not support the law because of the LGBTQI issue not having been treated within the law. I respect the independent voices. It sometimes causes the society to move forward. I make no complaint on that, but I'm telling the country that it was a PNM opposition and a UNC government that passed the Children's Act. Where would we be today without the Children's Act? Under a UNC government's authorship with a PNM government's contribution. Now I raise this to demonstrate the fact that sometimes we have to agree to start somewhere. Sometimes we have to say there is enough analysis paralysis. Sometimes we have to look at this particular bill in the context of the fact this law has been on the books of Trinidad and Tobago since the year 2000 with nobody on the register. And therefore the mischief that this law sought to solve of having people know that sexual offenders exist becomes a reality. Madam Speaker, Madam President, as central authority for the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago under the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, I can tell you that while we were debating this law last week, my office was able to go onto a particular website abroad where public knowledge of sex offenders is there for the entire world to see, and we were able to locate an offender, a pedophile of multiple versions in Trinidad and Tobago. Really? As a result of someone looking at this debate, going on to the internet, finding another jurisdiction and typing in Trinidad and Tobago sex offenders, a pedophile was discovered in this country. Is there merit in having a public register, ladies and gentlemen, honorable senators all? I've just given you one example of a reality that happened as a result of this discussion in this Senate. Is one life enough saved? You know what I often hear people tell me? I respect the law, I understand the law, but boy, if it's my child, that'll hold me back. I hear that in our society very often. I agree with Senator Choate's exhortation that the law requires a cool head. But the law does also require a defined policy. And a government elected to govern only has one privilege, to say what its policy is. The policy of this government, by way of recommendation to the honorable members of this Senate, is that there ought to be a public register. Are there pros and cons to having a public register? Yes, there are. That one example I've just given you of a real-life example is one thing on the positive side. Can there be vigilante justice? Can there be retribution? Yes, there can. But how about if we factor that discussion in the following? Everybody in this country knows a program called Beyond the Tape. and a program run by a fellow named Ian Allen. And in listening to those two programs, persons who are accused and in respect of whom warrants have been issued for arrest find themselves portrayed on these programs. Somebody who didn't pay maintenance, somebody who the police looking for rape, somebody who the police looking for a charge. Right now in this country, that is public information. When you are arrested under the Sexual Offences Act, the prohibition is that you cannot reveal the identity of the virtual complainant or complainant. There is no prohibition against the accused. When you are taken to a court to be assessed before a jury in a preliminary inquiry, or before the magistrate, in the preliminary inquiry, and the jury in the assizes, you are on parade with open reportage unless the court orders anonymity. When you are convicted, it is a public affair in this country. And I, as a person in public life, had that experience, as all of us have, of Googling yourself. But when you're a person in public life and you Google yourself, Lord God help you. You better learn to have a good sense of humor. You better learn to have a thick skin. And you better learn to laugh at yourself heartily. Some of the memes are outstanding. Apparently, people like to portray me in a dress, or in some form of position, or in a ridiculous situation, as happens to all of us. Senator Obika included. My point is that the internet survives and portrays everything. So I was on the point about publicity and about whether the register ought to be public or private. I certainly think that there is room for consideration of this registry in the context of whether one ought to have the right to have the judge order otherwise. The government's philosophy and policy in this is that there ought to be a fixed time frame inside of this law for you to report. That's been the law since the year 2000. If you are guilty of a certain category of offenses, as we've set out in the schedules to the law, we say that the defined terms ought to exist. But I'd like to point out, honorable senators, in demonstrating the intricacies of the bill, propose section 53. A registered sex offender may, on the completion of his reporting period, or on the basis of any compelling reasons, apply to the court to have the information contained in the register in relation to him expunged. What does that mean? If one believes that the shame to the family may affect the voice of the child who is the victim of incest because a father raped a child or an uncle raped a child, there is room in the intricacies of this bill right now to say, don't put me on the register because of the impact to the child. And what the government has structured, as I've just read from section 53, proposed section 53, which comes from clause 10, is the ability to expand the provisions to say why you should not go onto the register. But let the obligation be upon the person who has been convicted to go to the court and say, don't put me on. Because that accepts the reality of our society. Is our criminal justice system working? No. Is it only because of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service? Certainly not. We didn't have enough judges. Hence, the government came to say, raise the judicial complement by 77%. We didn't have any criminal proceedings rules, so we said, implement the criminal proceedings rules. We had bottlenecks in the court, so we said, let us remove bottlenecks by divisioning the courts. We didn't have specialist courts for children, so we said, put in specialist courts for children.
Section 53 talks about expunging, and the Attorney General is talking about not going on. It seems to me that you have to go on before it's been expunged. So I don't know exactly what provision he's talking about.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. You're perfectly correct, but I'm giving you an example of the intricacies which exist in the bill. I did start off by saying, yes, we can have some more conversation. So whether we move the concept for any other compelling reason in section 53 to section 52, and also Section 51 is open to us. But I'm giving an example of intricacies. You see, that's why the regulations are yet to be promulgated. And that's why we propose that this act actually would not be assented to until we had done the regs. Perhaps we ought to put in a proclamation clause, we could partially proclaim, etc. I'm saying we have not yet gotten to committee stage on this bill. It is at the committee stage that things go right. And I want to agree wholeheartedly with Senator Ramdeen. We as a parliament, we as a Senate, worked on the judge-only legislation. The House took a different view from the Senate. Certainly the opposition in the House took a completely different view from the Senate opposition. Because in the House we were told nobody would ever choose a judge-only trial. No murder accused in this country was going to ever select a judge-only trial. And yet we are in living reality where Madam Justice Gillian Luckey has proved the opposite. And dare I say that that is something and an event which we ought to pay attention to. Who could have believed 6 speed guns could cause Trinidad and Tobago to slow down and cause the death toll on our roads to fall? Who could have believed that the Minister of Works implementing a sticker for vehicles, for vans, for trucks, etc., could have caused people to want to get their vehicles inspected? Why? Because there was now a sanction applied to the circumstance. You see, our country has been unregulated and systems have not worked because people are genuinely in a level of analysis paralysis. And Madam President, it is important for us to decide where we are going to draw the line. So I'd like to say, Senator Haynes made a very interesting contribution. I agree with her that the research, and I want to compliment Senator Haynes for giving very good research on the philosophies and positions that stand behind whether a public register works or not. Senator Haynes gave us a reflection which Senator Thompson-Aye also reflected upon. She looked at the University of South Carolina study. But I've also found University of Michigan Law School scholarship repository articles, Faculty Scholarship 2011, entitled Do Sex Offender Registration and Notification Laws Affect Criminal Behavior? By J.J. Prescott, University of Michigan Law School. We found the Australian government, Australian Institute of Criminology, Trends and Issues in Crime and Criminal Justice, number 550 of May 2018, entitled What Impact Do Public Sex Offender Registries Have on Community Safety? By Sarah Napier and others. We found Bravehearts Foundation Limited, Australia position paper, Community Notification of Sex Offenders, November 2017, and the list goes on and on. And all of those publications say sex offender registries in the public domain work. So is the law in a state of flux? Is there agreement on this issue as to whether it ought to be private or it ought to be public? No, there's no agreement. Is the test to be found in our constitutional prescription? Yes. Section 13 of the Constitution, and 13.2 in particular, says that this law ought to effectively be proportionate and one which a democracy such as Trinidad and Tobago upholds. Do we have a statistically demonstrated sick society? Yes. Are 3-month-olds being raped and abused? Yes. Do we have a high incidence of incest in our country? Yes. Is it in the rural communities? Not necessarily. Because I, as Attorney General, have come forward and demonstrated that the vast majority of teenage pregnancies to babies making babies are found in the urban centers and not the rural centers. I demonstrated that statistically in the child marriage debate. But will the effect of a public register, will the effect of a stamp on your passport saying that you are a registered sex offender make a difference in our country? That's for us to decide. We have umpteen joint select committees. Umpteen. Senator Mark sits on many of them with me. There's one particular committee that we are actually discussing some law for 8 years now. 8 years we're talking about a law. Can't make a decision yet. Analysis paralysis, analysis paralysis. Over and over and over we go. Would a special select committee make a difference as recommended by Senator Richards? I dare say yes. But the issues are very narrow. Public versus private. Leave it to the judge to decide the period of reporting or other extraneous circumstances, or whether you go on or off. Do we put a stamp in your passport? Do we look to try and measure how to prevent sexual offenses in this law or not? Do we rely upon existing systems? Those are the 4 issues, you know. It's really not that broad. The government has drafted amendments to this bill after having listened to honorable senators. We propose to include victim impact assessment. We propose to amend the schedule so that we identify the schedules in specific form as to which laws are to be registrable offenses or not. We propose that there are circumstances in which before someone goes on to the register, they ought to have the right to say why they ought not to go on to the register. We propose that people ought to have the ability to be referred to victim impact positions or to offender management positions. But we also propose that there be a public register, because it's a balancing of rights. And we do believe that the time has to be there for consideration that enough is enough. Because, honorable senators, the statistics are going up. They're not going down. They could be going up for the right reason: more reporting. The work of the Children's Authority could be impactful because more people are reporting because they're coming out of the closet, literally. But without breaching the rules of anticipation, we come to this Parliament as well on the order paper right now to treat with witness anonymity, to treat with special procedures, because honorable senators are correct. Who is going to be the evidence, the witness evidence in the trial? Who is coming to report? If you look at the Sexual Offences Act, you'll realize, in answering Senator Hazel Thompson, and I thank her for referring me to Cayman, Jamaica, Antigua, Anguilla, etc., in looking at the persons with responsibility to report. I looked at it, but I went back to the existing law, and the existing law actually has a very interesting formula of words that can work, because it says anybody with temporary custody of the child, and then it gives certain examples. Can we look at clarifying it? Certainly we can. Everything's on the table. But honorable senators, whilst time is clocking, while Senator Mark has made the recommendation to let's have a review of legislation with periodic assessment, let's put things for affirmative resolution, standing recommendations coming from Senator Mark, which I understand and I appreciate. They come from him most respectfully when he's in opposition, not when he's in government. But it's in the Dangerous Drugs Act. It's in umpteen pieces of law. And the laws go on the books, and then we lose space and time because nobody's operationalizing the law. On this occasion, in government, this government has demonstrated we keep to our word, we accept contributions and keep undertakings as to when we'll come back and treat with them. I've met many an undertaking to Senator Ramdeen in particular. Many an undertaking. Because the submissions volunteered were sincere, they were intelligent, and they were intended to improve the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. At the time, I couldn't give the amendment requested because I didn't have the research or capacity without cabinet approval or stakeholder consultation to give it, but we've come back. And what we have done as a government for the first time is to do something that no other government has done. It's to provide Trinidad and Tobago statistics. No other government has provided Trinidad and Tobago statistics on everything that we have done. Energy, children, courts. The good, the bad, and the ugly have been presented here. Because in offering statistics, we invite the population to measure us against our performance on those statistics. When I sat in opposition, as I work now with the technocratic department that worked with my predecessors, the standing instruction from Attorney General Anand Ramlogan is, don't provide Faris with nothing. No marked up bill, no travel preparatoire, no consultation evidence, zero. Senator Ramdeen knows what I'm saying is true. Senator Vera would well remember as we sat. But we have taken a very different approach. We don't try to confuse you with the law, so you come in least prepared, honorable senators, because you can't understand the law because it's not put in the context of what's given to you. No, we have come with transparency. So, Madam President, this is a serious law. At a time when, as fate would have it, trafficking in persons became a reality in our news, with the reportage indicating that girls, babies as I call them, in our country that celebrates every religious festival known to God Almighty in his many forms, girls could be trafficked and sex slaves in our country. Really? Eid ul-Fitr, Eid ul-Adha, Diwali, celebration of Ganesh. 5 minutes? My point is, well made, in the multiple public holidays that we have, our society ought to be well and properly religious, but our actions and statistics standing as the public policy behind this demonstrate otherwise. So, will a public register within the new part sections assist us? We genuinely believe it will. Are the operational mechanisms in place for this? We genuinely think that they are. Can the TTPS move in a better direction? Yes. Are we intent, as honorable members have asked, on having a sexual offences specialist court? Yes. That's why we brought the criminal division bill, which is now an act, and in section 24 of that act, the Chief Justice has the ability to create a specialist court. So, honorable members, the ball is in the Senate's court. The ball allows us to save those baby girls as we've seen them in the news. One point I'd like to raise. Quite a few members have asked whether Section 31 of the Parent Act ought to be further treated, and they've asked about the issue of homosexuality. I'd like to put on the record that post the Jason Jones matter, the law as it stands has been amended. Post the Jason Jones matter and the delivery of Mr. Justice Rampasad's judgment, that law has been amended and it is not overturned. It will no doubt have clarification as it progresses through the courts, because the Privy Council will settle that matter. Why has that approach been taken? Because 27 other laws treat with the issue of homosexuality. The Immigration Act, the Cinematic, as they call it, Cinemas Act, Cinematograph Act. There are 27 laws that treat with that. So it is necessary to settle the law, but the law as it stands treats with that. Madam President, we believe that it would be opposite to the best interests of the citizens of this country if this law were to have the benefit of a special select committee of the Senate. Why? We have many joint select committees running at the same time. We would like to propose, as the leader of government business will manage this process post my conclusion, we would like to propose that we put a tight time frame. I have confidence that Senator Ramdeen and honorable members of the independent bench and other honorable members on the opposition bench, together with members of the government bench, that we can together fashion a tighter law. We can explore, explain. But we're going to come down to a report. The report may or may not have a minority report. We don't know yet. But I'd like to propose that the Honorable Senate finish its work before the end of March. Why the end of March? Why the end of March? Because the parliamentary term effectively goes on recess the first week in July. And therefore, parliamentary space is scarce. So, Madam President, there will be more to see. We will have good consensual deliberations. I am confident that this Senate can do it. And, Madam President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 66-1, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be referred to the following Special Select Committee of the Senate, hereby established to consider and report on the bill by March 29, 2019. Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Mrs. Paula Gopiskun, Mrs. Jennifer Baptiste Primus, Ms. Alison West, Mr. Foster Cummings, Mr. Gavin Simonet, Ms. Khadija Amin, Mr. Gerald Ramdeen, Mr. Paul Richards, Ms. Sophia Choate SC, Mr. Anthony Vera. Madam President, may I be allowed to repeat these names? Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Mrs. Paula Gopiskun, Mrs. Jennifer Baptiste Primus, Ms. Alison West, Mr. Foster Cummings.
Thank you, Madam President. Honourable Minister, the suggestion is for Senator Deyalsingh to be, the suggestion is from the independent benches for Senator Deyalsingh to be on the committee.
In place of?
In place of Senator Vera. Thank you.
Madam President, with your permission, may I read this batting order of 11 names? Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Mrs. Paula Gopiskun, Mrs. Jennifer Baptiste Primus, Ms. Alison West, Mr. Foster Cummings, Mr. Gavin Simonet, Mr. Gerald Ramdeen, Ms. Anita Haynes, Mr. Paul Richards, Ms. Sophia Choate, Senior Counsel, and number 11, Dr. Varma Deyalsingh.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be referred to the following Special Select Committee of the Senate, hereby established to consider and report on the bill by March the 29th, 2019. Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Mrs. Paula Gopiskun, Mrs. Jennifer Baptiste Primus, Ms. Alison West, Mr. Foster Cummings, Mr. Gavin Simonet, Ms. Anita Haynes, Mr. Gerald Ramdeen, Mr. Paul Richards, Ms. Sophia Choate, Senior Counsel, Dr. Varma Deyalsingh. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Acting Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I beg to move that this Senate be adjourned to Monday, Tuesday, 19th February at 1:30 p.m. And on that occasion, we'll deal with the trespass bill. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for 2 matters to be raised. Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, it is no secret that Venezuela is facing one of the greatest political crises in the world's history. This crisis has affected the citizens of Venezuela and by extension affected the South American and Caribbean region. Trinidad and Tobago is not immune from the turmoil that is taking place in Venezuela. We are placed approximately 471 miles away from Venezuela. And being so close, Trinidad and Tobago is the most convenient destination for those who choose to flee because of the social, political, and economic unrest. Everyone is aware of the high influx of the number of Venezuelans in our country, those who entered legally or illegally. It is not known the exact number of those Venezuelans who are currently residing here in Trinidad and Tobago. As a country, Trinidad and Tobago did not ready itself for this phenomenon. There are several categories of those Venezuelans who entered our shores: those who entered legally, those who entered illegally, and those who entered legally and or illegally but sought refugee status. Let us look at what our laws in Trinidad and Tobago are to treat with this issue. On the 10th of November 2000, Trinidad and Tobago became a signatory to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol, where we as a country placed international obligations on ourselves to treat with refugees in a certain manner. Therefore, we have international law that should guide our policy with respect to the Venezuelan issue, unless we file any reservations regarding the treaty. There is one UN organ that is situated in Port of Spain, the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, that deals with those who are desirous of attaining refugee status. I am advised that when an application is made and the applicant is successful, that person is issued an ID card by the UNHCR. These ID cards are issued after a thorough investigation have been completed by the Office of the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, identifying them as refugees. Madam President, recently the Prime Minister announced that government would be addressing the issue of regularizing refugees and asylum seekers with the provision of identification to assist in their protection. And the Honorable Prime Minister, and I quote, said, "I said that we have agreed to a registration exercise which would allow us to give Venezuelans over here some sort of identification, which would allow us to know who they are, know their comings and goings, and of course, to protect them from exploitation." We talked about the question of allowing them to work and to go to school. The Minister of Security is actively engaged in bringing that position to the Cabinet. Now, Madam President, I've outlined that the most competent body to determine the status of refugees is the UNHCR, and they issue ID cards. Therefore, it raises many concerns regarding what the registration process in terms of the identification of these Venezuelans are going to be undertaken by the government as announced by the Prime Minister. Is it going to be a special type of ID card? Who will be issuing the ID card? What is the nature of this card? What rights will be given to the holder of this identification? Now, Madam President, it was brought to my attention, and I was asked to raise this matter, that under Section 13 of the Representation of the People Act, it states that a person is qualified as an elector who is 18 years or older and who is not a Commonwealth citizen, but has or will have resided in Trinidad and Tobago for a continuous period of at least 5 years immediately preceding such date, and has resided in the district for at least 2 months from the qualifying date of registration. Madam President, this raises a lot of questions regarding the registration of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago and eligibility of electors under the Representation of People Act. Hence the reason that this motion was brought to determine from the government what is the status and the nature of those identification cards or whatever mechanism is going to be used to identify these Venezuelans who are in Trinidad and Tobago. And what the announcement by the Prime Minister, Madam President, also shows a policy shift by the government. because the government in the first instance spoke of the rights to work and the rights of schooling of those children of the refugees in Trinidad and Tobago. And they did not take any solid position with regards to those rights that are given to those refugees under the international obligations that we have through the 1951 Convention. So, Madam President, is it that the government now has a policy shift because they're going to offer, through these identification cards, work and employment and schooling education for the citizens of Venezuela? So I ask on behalf of those who have asked me to raise this matter and the opposition, if the government can give an indication with regard to the nature of the registration exercise and the status of the identification to be issued to those Venezuelan nationals who are here in Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs.
Madam President, thank you very much. For a person who has fled his or her home country and seeks refuge in another, the lack of identity documents may be far more than a source of inconvenience. In almost all countries, a person must be able to prove not only his identity, but also that his presence in the country is lawful. In some countries, persons without appropriate documentation are subject to detention and sometimes instant removal from the country. Such measures are particularly serious for a refugee, defined by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees as a person who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence, or for an asylum seeker, one whose request for sanctuary is yet to be processed. For such a person, there may also be the possibility of premature return to his country of origin. Even where the consequences of being without documentation are less drastic, such an individual, in order to benefit from treatment in accordance with international best practices, needs to be able to establish not only his or her identity, but also his or her status as a refugee or asylum seeker. Due to the circumstances in which they are sometimes forced to leave their home country, refugees are perhaps more likely than other migrants to find themselves without identity or documents. Moreover, while other migrants can turn to the authorities of their countries of origin for help in obtaining documents, refugees do not have this option and are therefore dependent upon the authorities of their country of refuge or upon the United Nations High Commission for Refugees for assistance in this regard. Madam President, in Trinidad and Tobago, interim standard operating procedures were developed and mutually agreed upon by the Immigration Division of the Ministry of National Security and the implementing partner for the UNHCR in Trinidad and Tobago and the Living Water community. These SOPs, or standard operating procedures, guide the actions of the representatives of the Living Water community, as well as the officers of the Immigration Division, pending the enactment of a legislation to give effect to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees and in accordance with the national policy to address refugees and asylum matters in Trinidad and Tobago, which was approved by the Cabinet of our country in June of 2014. The national policy framework on refugees is not yet complete. Such a framework involves an extensive multi-sectoral approach that accurately forecasts the social and economic costs to the state, as well as gives adequate consideration to the impact on society as a whole. To this end, the Ministry of National Security, the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance, as well as local and international partners, are all involved in extensive consultations towards completing this policy. Currently, there are approximately 7,000 Venezuelan nationals who are registered asylum seekers in Trinidad and Tobago, and 700 recognized refugees of Venezuelan nationality. Persons seeking asylum can either make contact or approach the Living Water community or the Immigration Division. In either case, once evidence is provided supporting their claim, that individual qualifies as an asylum seeker and is then placed on an order of supervision into the care of the living water community. However, if the individual does not qualify as an asylum seeker, the Immigration Division will take steps to return the individual to the original port of origin or other appropriate action. Madam President, with the continuous influx of foreign nationals to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, there is need for identity documents for applicants for refugee status. During the period preceding the determination of refugee status, asylum applicants clearly have the same need for appropriate identity documents as recognized refugees. Therefore, the asylum applicant should be provided with adequate documentation to ensure that his provisional right to protection against refoulement will be respected and that he will be treated in accordance with his status as a person who may in fact be a refugee. There is an established procedure for determining refugee status. The UNHCR issues a certificate or a card acknowledging that an application for refugee status has in fact been made. This certificate or card may be used by asylum applicants as provisional documentation until a decision has been taken on their application. This certificate or card does not, however, include a photograph of the bearer, which in the absence of accepted identification, such as a conventional travel document, makes it very difficult to verify that the bearer of the card is the person to whom it has been issued. While awaiting the processing of their application, asylum seekers will receive a stipend from UNHCR. It should be noted that this does not give them permission to work, nor does it give their children the right to attend school while awaiting the status of their application. In addition, asylum seekers who have been determined as recognized refugees also have a waiting period before they are received by the country. Madam President, the government of Trinidad and Tobago acknowledges the importance of refugees having documentation which would enable them to establish their identity as well as their status as refugees. The necessity of providing all refugees with such documentations is recognized in Article 27 of the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. Applications, or rather applicants for refugee status, should be provided with provisional documentation showing their identity and the fact that they are permitted to remain in the country until a decision concerning refugee status has been reached by the competent authority. It is also necessary for such identity documentation for refugees and asylum applicants to be issued in a format that prevents misuse and enables the relevant authorities to be satisfied that the person using the document is in fact the person to whom it has been issued. Madam President, the extension of the practice of registering and issuing documentation to refugees and asylum seekers in large-scale influx situations should be welcomed. It is hoped that the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago will undertake such documentation programs where appropriate in cooperation with the UNHCR and other stakeholders, such as the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, Ministry of Education and Election and Boundaries Commissions, which shall form part of the eligibility committee. At this time, Madam President, the Ministry of National Security is in the process of determining the procedure for the issue of the ID cards and will issue further information in the coming weeks with respect to progress on this matter. Further discussions will be held by the Ministry of National Security, the Immigration Department, or rather Division, and other agencies such as the UNHCR and Living Water Community to ensure that all stakeholders are included and that processes are streamlined and set in motion in the shortest possible time. Allow me to thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. The need for the government to report on the progress made to ensure that legislation on parliamentary autonomy as approved by the Senate in the third session, is introduced for consideration by the Houses of Parliament in the fourth session of the 11th Parliament. Madam President, the motion was moved and debated on March the 6th, 2018, and a number of senators contributed to this motion. The motion was moved by Senator Wade Mark, and contributors were Senator the Honorable Jennifer Batiste Primus, former Senator David Small, Senator Khadija Amin, Senator Daniel Duque, Senator Anita Haynes. The debate continued on March the 27th, 2018, and the following persons spoke. Former Senator Dr. Danishwa Mahabir, Senator Nigel De Freitas, Senator Saddam Hussein, Senator Melissa Ramkisoon, former, Senator Ronald Huggins, former, Senator Clive Dotton, former and temporary, and of course, Senator Tahaka Obika. Madam President, this particular matter continued in the month of April, this debate. On April 24th, we had Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambarat, Senator Gerald Ramdeen, former Senator Ian Roach. I concluded the debate, and subsequently, Senator Franklin Khan brought the curtains down on that entire matter. Madam President, it is to be noted that the motion was approved with amendments on April 24th, 2018. The original motion read, and I quote, "Be it resolved that the Senate call on the government to introduce legislation by April 30th, 2018, to give effect to parliamentary autonomy, and that this legislation be immediately referred to a joint select committee of Parliament for early consideration and report." Madam President, this motion was amended and approved by this Honorable Senate. The amended motion, which was approved unanimously by the Senate, reads as follows: "Be it resolved that the Senate call on the government to introduce legislation on parliamentary autonomy during the fourth session of the 11th Parliament, and have same referred to a joint select committee of Parliament for consideration and report before the end of the fourth session of the 11th Parliament." Madam President, Standing Order 41 of the Senate states, and I quote, "Every private member's motion approved by the Senate which requires action on national policy issues shall be submitted by the clerk of the Senate to the Cabinet for consideration within 1 week of the date of approval by the Senate." And subsection 2 of Standing Order 41 goes on to state further, "A report on the Cabinet's decision in response to the submission made pursuant to paragraph 1 shall be tabled," I want to repeat, "shall be tabled by the leader of government business in the Senate not later than 30 days from the date of its submission to the Cabinet. Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 41 of the Senate Secretariat wrote to the Secretary of the Cabinet, shortly after the sit-in on April the 24th, 2018. Madam President, I don't have a copy of the correspondence. I don't have access to a copy of the correspondence sent by the Secretariat of the Senate to the Cabinet. But the information I have is that it was sent subsequent to April the 24th, 2018. Madam President, that would make us 8 months and a couple days. We have not seen, I have not received, nor any member of the Senate, any document from the government in response to the letter sent by the Secretariat at the end of April, early May, where there was unanimous agreement that the government will take steps to effect this measure. So I have raised this matter because the agreement was, Madam President, that parliamentary autonomy will take effect by the end of the 4th session of the life of this parliament. The 4th session of the life of this parliament comes to an end in September of 2019. And Madam President, we are in the month of February. Today is the 11th, I think, Madam President, and we are yet to get a document. Am I wrong? The 12th, Madam President. Thank you. Today is the 12th of February. I'm corrected by the Honorable President. And Madam President, we have not had the courtesy of the document being tabled 30 days after, in accordance with our standing orders. So I do not want to accuse the government of contempt of this Honorable Senate. Madam President, I don't want to. So I am giving the government the benefit of the doubt to explain to this Senate, Madam President, what is the position of this particular matter as it relates to the future. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Attorney General.
Madam President, I wish to thank the Honourable Senator for raising an issue of concern. Standing Order 41 of the Senate is entitled Motions on National Policy Issues. And it does provide that every member's motion, private member's motion, approved by the Senate, which requires action on national policy issues, shall be submitted by the Clerk of the Senate to the Cabinet for consideration within 1 week of the date of approval by the Senate. It does go on in subsection 2 to say, a report on the Cabinet's decision in response to this submission made pursuant to paragraph 1 shall be tabled by the leader of government business in the Senate not later than 30 days from the date of its submission to Cabinet. I wish to firstly apologize on behalf of the government for not having been able, for reasons which I will explain, to comply with Standing Order 41-2. And that is specifically because the issue before the Cabinet is one of far-reaching ramification and one which requires a degree of consultation and policy development which affects fundamentally entrenched aspects of our Constitution. It is perhaps not difficult to prove that submission and therefore offer an explanation for the delay in the following example. If it is that learned colleagues opposite recognize that this was such a burning issue in the period 2010 to 2015, when there was a full constitutional majority in the House of Representatives for the full 5 years and 3 months in occupation then, one can only guess and measure an example of explanation by saying, surely it was because of the very complexity and far-reaching ramifications, and not because of the sincerity of the issue, that my learned colleagues on the opposition bench did not take advantage of a full constitutional majority in the period 2010 to 2015 to conduct the exercise recommended by the Honourable Senator Wade Mark. Surely that must be the reason, because the business was that serious for it to have been brought in the time that it was brought. Regrettably, I think that the standing orders perhaps did not contemplate for issues which may require something as deep as a 3/4 majority support in this House, that 1 month would be enough time. But perhaps the standing orders did, in fact, comment and consider upon that form, because there's no sanction to Standing Order 42. And therefore, I prove the point, Madam President, as I humbly apologize, that this is no small matter. The autonomy of the Parliament is also deeply rooted to the financial arrangements around which the Parliament can enjoy its autonomy. And when one has the obligation to run the economy after crashing into a financial wall created by my learned colleagues on the opposition bench, in seeing our oil and gas revenue depleted by 96% as it relates to taxation from oil and gas, in watching $60 billion of expenditure, $29 billion of wastage, Madam Speaker, in having 33 ministries run when 23 could have done it, in having a Beetham wastewater treatment facility with billions down the drain, in having the bankrolling of Trinidad and Tobago done via the overdraft, in taking the reserves from the National Gas Corporation, surely one understands that the parliamentary autonomy, which this motion commendably recognizes, has to be paid for. And if we are to talk in practical sense and understanding, the support for financial autonomy for an autonomous parliament is intricate to the policy considerations which the government at the cabinet level must consider. Now, Madam President, no strangers in this House to the need for consultation. We've dealt with some very clear-cut issues that my learned colleagues opposite say we have to have deeper consultation on. There are some examples where we stand on laws that have been on the books for 20 years, 26 years, 30 years, sometimes 100 years, where we're invited to have more consultation. In one particular Joint Select Committee right now, we are consulting on a piece of law for 8 years straight and can't get a straight answer in a Joint Select Committee. So, the government apologizes for not yet being able to bring forward the policy considerations which would result in draft legislation for submission to the Parliament into a Joint Select Committee of the Parliament. Number one, it's a deep and long exercise which is complicated, proved by the fact that my learned friends, when in government, simply didn't even bother to do it. And I don't think it was because they didn't want to. It must have been because it was very complicated and they didn't have the space to do it. Secondly, it requires considerations of a financial nature, which requires us to have the bankrolling behind the autonomy carefully considered, because it will involve amendments to the Constitution potentially and other pieces of law. So in the circumstances, Madam Speaker, Madam President, I certainly do intend to relay the consternation of this Honourable House as to the production of this particular piece of work, and we will give our best efforts to provide the work product suggested. And I thank you.
Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 19th of February, 2019, at 1:30 p.m. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, the 19th of February, 2019, at 1:30 p.m.